the way I would analyze that question is I would try to measure the scale of investments in key areas that are needed to achieve the goals that we've set and compare that with the scale of current investments. And so I like to think in terms of 6 categories of investment as constitutive of the SDGs: investment in education, investment in health, investment in clean energy and industry, investment in agriculture and sustainable land use, investment in urban infrastructure, and investment in digital access and platforms. So education, health, industry, agriculture, urban infrastructure, and digital. And one it's not easy to do, and I spend my off hours on spreadsheets trying to answer this question, and have done so for the last 15 years, basically. What is the scale of investment needed? The right way to do this is bottom up, not one person sitting with his Excel spreadsheets or modeling, but actually teams that work on this. An example is the International Energy Agency's net zero to 2050 scenario, or UNESCO has estimates for education. But strangely enough, as a UN system, we don't produce these numbers systematically very well, because the UN is more diplomacy and less numbers, and it should be more numbers. Actually, we should have the capacity to produce these numbers quite systematically. I'll give you another weird reality of our system, and that's the IMF. The IMF is the organization in our family that is responsible for the macroeconomics. That includes scale of finance, especially public finance, as well as international borrowing. A few years ago, slightly maliciously, not really maliciously, but you'll get the point, I said to one of the leaders of the IMF, "So how much does it cost to educate a child in a low-income country?" And they said, "I don't know." And I said, "But that's your job to know, because you're sitting with the finance minister. How much does it cost to have universal health coverage just per person?" "Well, I don't know." We had a very good discussion. Lovely person, by the way, very strong professional. They had never looked at this. Can you imagine, by the way, the IMF, which the job of the IMF is to consult with the finance minister. That's the core of the IMF's work, is to consult with the finance minister, had no idea of the unit costs for anything, whether it's energy, water connections, roads, putting a kid in school. Why? Because the way they do their job, till today, by the way, is, "Minister, what are your revenues? Now live within them. We're not going to dictate. We suggest you keep good social balance and so forth, but live within your revenues. Don't make trouble for the world by getting into debt trouble. So live within your means." My conception for the last 30 years of my professional academic life has been that the IMF should do something quite different. The IMF should say, "Minister, come sit next to me. Let's look at this spreadsheet together. You have a big financing gap for education. Half your kids aren't in school. Let's add that. You don't have obstetrical care. Oh my God, let's add that. You need some roads. I see that half the people don't have electricity. Let's add all this together. Oh, you have a gap of $27 billion a year. And since we are the UN family system to help you, we're going to help you go out to get good financing to cover that gap." That's my dream of what the IMF would do. Of course, the US would go a little crazy because the whole debate started with the US saying in 1944, we are the creditor nation, thank you. We will decide what gets lent. And that's what they told John Maynard Keynes in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. And if you do know the geography of power in the world, 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington is the Treasury. 16th and Pennsylvania Avenue is the White House. 17th and Pennsylvania is the Executive Office Building of the President. 18th and Pennsylvania is the World Bank. And 19th and Pennsylvania is the IMF. So that's how this was created. I believe because the IMF has, I love the place, by the way. I've been spending my whole life trying to help them put the finance minister on this side and work together with them. And I've trained a large number of the staff. And I tell them often, that's not what you learned in class. So I'm trying to help them do the right thing. But that's a power situation also, obviously. So to answer your question, first of all, there is no definitive answer to this. Second, so how big approximately? Somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion a year. Okay, now, is that a lot or a little? The world output is $100 trillion a year. The world saving is $30 trillion a year. So we're talking about 3 to 5% of world GDP. And we're talking about maybe, 10% to 16.6% of global saving. Perfectly manageable. And saving isn't fixed, it could rise and so forth. So the gaps are not huge. They are quite manageable, given that these are our major global goals. And certainly the gaps for the poorest countries are not at all big. Maybe $1 trillion a year. And $1 trillion a year is 1% of world output. And if you gave me $1 trillion a year, I would be able to help every government get out of poverty. That would be enough to make investments, get all the kids in school, get health care for every person, get water and electricity connection for every person. That'd be a great start. And you could do that for $1 trillion a year for all the billion people in extreme poverty. So it's not huge. So then comes lots of detailed, interesting analytical questions. First, some of it is for rich countries, but the gap there isn't really a financing gap, it's a political choice gap. They're just not making investments, but the finance is available. Where the gap is really most consequential is for countries that cannot mobilize this out of their domestic resources. A poor country cannot afford to get all its kids in school, by the way. This is very weird, because you'd think, well, at least you can do that. But I've spent 10 years on this calculation. And if you're a low-income country, it costs between 10 and 15% of GDP for universal primary and secondary education. Very high. The reason is teachers are relatively costly in low-income countries, and there are a lot of young kids in low-income countries because they have high fertility rates, so the whole age pyramid is very wide. So there's not an African country, low-income or lower-middle-income country, that can actually afford SDG 4. And that should be the most alarming fact in the world, because you cannot have economic development without your kids educated. No matter what else you do, you cannot have economic development without educated kids. So it's for the low and lower middle income countries that the crisis is biggest. There are gaps in the high income countries, but I don't worry too much about them because those are political obstacles that should be filled, but it's manageable. Upper middle income is tricky because some upper middle income countries have good access to credit, others don't have access to credit. Then there's another consideration. Sorry, and I'll come to a conclusion. Technically, what do? There are two related issues. One, how could you make capital flow at relatively low cost and long-term maturity to poorer countries? This is the major technical question on finance. If you look at the penalties that low-income countries pay to borrow, they're quite steep. You pay 10 or 15% interest rates if you are a double B borrower, sub-investment grade, compared to what a triple A or double A minus borrower pays. And why is that? Long story, and I won't go into it, but making that flatter so that for poor countries they have access to low-cost capital is crucial. One way to do that is larger multilateral development banks. This is, everybody agrees on that, though they don't agree to do it, but they agree that that's one part of the solution. More ADB, more AIIB, more new development bank, more World Bank. That requires capital increases. Capital increases mean larger voting shares for China. The United States needs to swallow, and Europe needs to swallow and get on with it. So that's one part of what needs to be done. The second part is to de-risk private capital flows. That's also a tricky set of issues. I'd say I got into that question 45 years ago as a graduate student, and it's still somewhat of a puzzle. It's a long story, but it's not impossible to do that. There's one more dimension, and because also you're from the Russian Federation, I want to mention it, and that is that there's an intrinsic link between global finance and global monetary arrangements. And global monetary arrangements mean how we settle trade. And we are, of course, in a largely dollar-based settlements system. So the monetary system is largely dollar-based, not exclusively, but about 60%. And the United States, unfortunately and unwisely, weaponized the dollar-based payment system starting about 15 years ago by seizing assets, including Russian assets recently, the $300 billion seized in 2022, but also Iran, North Korea, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and a number of others. To my mind, this is a completely unacceptable and self-defeating policy. It's cheap because the President of the United States can do it with a stroke of the pen. You don't have to ask Congress, you don't have to ask the public, you don't have to ask the UN, you don't have to ask anybody. To my mind, it's blatantly illegal and absolutely practically unwise. Because why would you use dollars if the US is going to take them away from you when they don't like what you're doing? The idea of payments is that they're reliable, not that they're political. So this is why the BRICS countries, especially under Russia's leadership this year, are negotiating non-dollar payments. And I support this entirely. But I also say to the US Treasury all the time, don't confiscate other people's money. It's not a good policy. It's not going to work. And the idea, by the way, of grabbing Russia's $300 billion for Ukraine is so illegal you don't even know where to start. But these are politicians. They're not lawyers. They're not diplomats. They're not financiers. They want quick solutions for their re-elections. So this is really a problem. But it's a problem that also has a solution because we just won't use the dollar in places where the United States policies could lead to confiscation. So all of this means we have a bit of a morass in the international financial system within our family of getting the right answers to the financing questions. There's actually one more technical point I need to mention, which is that the IMF and the World Bank have what they call the Debt Sustainability Framework, or DSF. And it's based on an arbitrary set of numbers where they say we grade you whether you're weak, medium, or strong in debt management. And then based on your ranking, we give you a ceiling of gross debt to GDP. And the ceiling is no more than 30% debt to GDP ratio if you are a weakly governed country. This is a death certificate. This is not economic policy. Why? Because if you're a poor country, it means almost by definition you don't have electricity, you don't have paved roads, you don't have digital access, and your kids aren't in school. So what the IMF and the World Bank are telling you is stay that way. Don't bother us. Don't borrow because you might get into debt trouble. But if you don't borrow, you won't have electricity, schools, or anything else. They don't have an alternative solution for these countries. So they're telling the countries, don't borrow. I'm telling the countries, borrow. But my advice is borrow 30-year maturity, fixed interest rates, and on reasonable terms. But where do you get those? That's where I want the G20 to come into this story, to give an answer to that. But when I do, again, in my spare time, solving a growth model for how much you should borrow if you want to have your kids in school, have electricity, and so on, exactly your question, the debt actually rises to about 200% of GDP before it starts declining 30 years from now. You want to borrow a lot because you don't want to live without electricity, you don't want to live without roads, you don't want to live without educated children, you don't want to live without health facilities. So you want to borrow, but you want the borrowing to be very long term so that you have 40 years to grow in order to repay the debt 40 years from now. The IMF has none of this intertemporal analysis because the debt sustainability framework is a 5-year snapshot. It's not a growth scenario. Now, I taught intertemporal growth for 30 years, and this is where I tell my students, you learn something, right? You borrow if the rate of return on your investment is higher than the cost of capital, and if you're not going to get into a debt crisis in the meantime. So we need to create a finance framework that can work. Final words. For this region, SCAP, there are a few countries that are seriously debt constrained or finance constrained. Most are not, but some are. For Africa, it's pervasive. The whole continent is debt constrained right now. So that's where the most serious problems are. Within this region, you have the means to solve the problem because this is a high saving region. And China has a saving surplus. That's why initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative are wonderful. And they should really be encouraged. But the advice I give to China is when you lend for the Belt and Road Initiative, lend for 30 years. Don't lend for 10 years or 12 years. You will be disappointed and your counterpart will be very disappointed because they'll get into debt crisis. And that's what's happening right now. Not that China set a debt trap, that's propaganda. China didn't set a debt trap, it just set a maturity structure too short. And so when I speak to the Chinese finance authorities, I'm telling them 30-year loans. And nobody thinks ahead more than China. So China needs to do the same thing of looking at a 30-year perspective, and especially for the poorer countries, give much longer term loans. And for the rest of the US, unfortunately, is not a net savings surplus country. It's a net debtor country. So it can't offer much in finance anymore. But the capital markets could offer more, and we need to tap that. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but good, very good question, important question.